Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Why is it that in Switzerland the trains run on time, all the clocks are correct, and it's considered rude to be late for a meeting, while in Brazil it's normal to show up late for a business meeting, and all the clocks show different times? Cultural psychologist Michele Gelfand, a professor of psychology at the University of Maryland, studies the differing social norms and tolerance for deviating behavior in various cultures, and she's developed a theory that there are tight cultures and loose cultures. In her new book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World, it's from Scribner, she explains what makes a culture tight or loose and how this information can help us to understand and interact with people from different cultures. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
What makes a culture tight or loose? Is it the relative strength of its social norms?
That's right. You know, it's interesting. All cultures have social norms or unwritten rules for behavior. We couldn't operate on a daily basis without norms. I mean, in fact, we're an ultra-normative species. We don't even realize how much we're following rules from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to sleep. And it's interesting, like you just take it for granted that we all put clothes on, typically, when we walk outside of the house, and we don't face backwards in the elevators, and we don't sing in libraries. So rules are important to coordinate our action, and some cultures have stronger rules than others.
Are tight cultures those that have stricter rules and less tolerance for deviations of behavior?
That's right. So tightness is really about having strong rules and having a lot of punishments for deviating from rules. Loose cultures have fewer rules, and they're much more permissive. And what's so interesting about tightness, looseness, and I describe in the book, is it's really kind of a fractal pattern that is a concept that comes from physics. It's a recurring pattern that you see across nations, across states, across organizations, across even in our own households. Even each of us have our own tight and loose mindset, and it has the same properties at different levels in terms of its antecedents and its consequences.
I'm sure pretty much all societies have certain rules, for example, about crime and punishment, although the punishments may vary. But what about the unwritten rules like dress codes and standards of grooming and tattoos and nose rings, which sounds a lot like people I see on the subway right here in New York. So I'm wondering whether we have a loose rule culture here.
Well, in our study across 33 nations, we were able to classify countries in terms of how strict or permissive they were, how tight or loose. And places like Singapore, Japan, Germany, they erred on the tight end of the continuum. Places like Brazil, Greece, including also the Netherlands and the U.S., veered looser.
And in the United States, it depends on where you are?
It does. Actually, we can zoom in this country because we have so much diversity, unlike in places like Singapore, where it's harder to find diversity and tightness. But we can see that we can rank order the 50 states in terms of how tight or loose they are.
And then there are standards of punctuality. In New York, it's almost assumed that you're going to arrive 10 minutes late. In fact, it's rude to arrive a little early.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in loose cultures, there's a wide range of permissible behavior. In tighter cultures, there's a more restriction of range.
What about political corruption, things like bribery?
In terms of its connection to tight-loose?
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that...
I mean, is it more tolerated in a loose society?
We don't find any direct connection between bribery and looseness, but I can say that we see a lot more norm violations. We see people violating rules of etiquette. We see them jaywalking. We see them littering and so forth. There's much less order in loose cultures. There's much more order in tight cultures.
But we also might consider whether people feel they have a right to demonstrate and question authority.
Yeah, that's right. That's definitely the mark of looseness. What we find is that in tight cultures, there's a lot of order. There's less crime, but there's also less voice. And in loose cultures, there's more crime, there's more disorder, but there's more protests.
What about social issues like adultery, premarital sex, homosexuality, alcoholism, drug use? Are they all discouraged in tight cultures?
Yeah, there's a strong connection between having more, let's say, self-regulation in tight cultures. So they tend to have less debt. They tend to be less fat. They tend to have less alcoholism, less drug abuse, and that's much higher in loose cultures.
That's often tied also to religiosity. Or is there a link between loose and tight culture?
Yeah, definitely.
And religion?
If you think about tight cultures, they're often places where you feel monitored. Actually, we had RAs go around the world, and they can see more security cameras, more police per capita. And religion has the same function of being monitored. So when you're feeling monitored by God or government, you are better behaved.
But England has probably more security cameras than any other place in the world, and I don't think of it as a necessarily tight culture.
Well, that's interesting. In our data, the UK is definitely tighter than the United States. And so we really want to try to disentangle that. Not all Western cultures are loose, and not all Asian cultures are tight.
What got you interested in this subject? Did it come out of your own experiences in traveling in different countries?
Yeah, I think, when well, first I'll say that as a young kid, I was a sheltered Long Island kid, and I went to London for a semester, and we're just really in a serious state of culture shock. And I remember calling my father from Brooklyn, and I said, "Dad, people are going from New York, they're going from London to Paris just for the weekend. It's so strange." And he said, and this changed my life, this one sentence. He said, just think about it like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania. And literally the next day, this is a true story, I booked a trip to Egypt by myself. And I said, "Dad, it's just like me going from New York, California." He was not too happy about this. But it's there in Egypt in my travels and working in different cultures that I realized that I don't know anything about culture. It's so omnipresent, but it's invisible. And I went out to study it for my life.
But going from London to Egypt is not the same thing as going from London to Paris. It's not even the same thing as going from New York to California.
Well, I thought,
that was a bigger leap of faith, wasn't it?
It was, but it was such a powerful metaphor, and it gave me the sort of sense of curiosity about the world and safety that you can go and explore. And again, culture is so puzzling because it's so omnipresent. It's driving our behavior. We invented culture. We need it, but we don't recognize it. And then I went to the University of Illinois to study with Harry Triandis, the father of our field, cross-cultural psychology, and the rest is history.
You did field research in, 33 different countries?
Yeah, so
How do you choose which countries to do?
Well, that's a good question because, we had a National Science Foundation grant when we had to, at some point, stop collecting data. But I chose these countries based on what criteria I thought would predict tightness. And actually, what was interesting is that tight cultures and loose culture, they don't share anything in particular in terms of geography or in terms of language or religion, but tight cultures tend to have a lot of threat. And I chose these nations based on to have variability in threat, based on things like natural disasters or invasions or pathogens or population density. So the countries I chose had a lot of variance on those factors.
But you didn't go to sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, we actually didn't have the possibility. We didn't have collaborators in those regions at the time. And now we're starting to do more research, and particularly in the Middle East.
But did you focus more or less on developed countries?
To some extent, but we have we have countries that vary tremendously on GDP. So what's interesting is that there's no strong connection between tight, loose, and GDP. There are tight cultures that are rich, and there are tight cultures that are poor, and likewise with loose cultures.
And I'm assuming the cities and rural areas are quite different.
That's right. I mean, you can kind of zoom in and see that in rural areas, there's much more monitoring. People have the gossip mill going on, and there's tighter norms in those contexts.
On the other hand, would a country have kind of a unified culture?
Well, this is
especially
interesting.
the ones where there's a dominant religion.
Yeah. Well, what we can see is that you can sort of think about this as a microscope. You can zoom out and see that you can classify America as looser than Japan, for example. But then you can zoom in and you can find pockets in the United States that are tight and loose, and in Japan even you can find contexts that are tight and loose.
Southern California is different from Northern California, or the area in between, and quite different from the rural South and the Midwest. Yeah. So, and I know from my own experiences in this country, when I tell people in places like Arizona that I'm from New York, they look at me as though I've come from Mars.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting. In our data, we could see that tight states are very polite, and loose states, like New York, are much more rude. But on the flip side, tight states tend to have less fun. They're a little more boring, according to our data. And it's the opposite for loose states. They tend to have more fun.
Did you interview people from different states and average them?
Yeah, so we can look at other indicators of latitude and constraint. We can look at how many dry counties there are in a state. We can look at how many kids are punished in schools. And we can do what we call factor analysis and see whether there's an underlying factor and then compare states and also measure attitudes. And so you can see that, for example, people share their attitudes about their the cultural groups.
But I wonder about dry counties because in my experiences in dry counties, many of the people went across the state, the county line, to the nearest liquor store to buy their stuff. So was it just a matter of some kind of convention that they had bought into, even though they weren't going to live by it themselves?
Yeah. Well, there's actually a lot of data at the state level that we see the same trade-off with tight-loose that we see at the national level. There's more order and there's more openness in loose cultures. And we could see, for example, that tight states tend to have less artists per capita, they have less patents per capita, they're less creative, but they tend to have less drug abuse, and they tend to have less alcoholism, and they tend to have less debt. So at the state level, we could see a very clear pattern. Loose cultures, by the way, have also less discrimination, whereas tight cultures suffer from that. When we analyze EEOC claims around the country, we could see clear state variation in these signatures of tight and loose.
But then, to me, it gets a bit more confusing. Here in Brooklyn, hipsters and Orthodox Jews live in the same neighborhoods. Would those two very different cultures have any similarity in their tightness quotients?
It depends. I mean, you can see subcultures in all areas of the world. And we would predict, of course, that once you look in those cultures, that you'll see differences in tight-loose.
So how did you conduct your surveys? How many people did you interview in an area?
So we conducted surveys of about 7,000 people around the world. We conducted surveys and used surveys in the United States across thousands of people. And we also use other methods. We have people going around the world, for example, wearing facial stigmas and seeing how they're treated. These are called unobtrusive measures. We peer into the brain using fMRI techniques in the US and China to see how are people reacting to norm violators. So our research is
What would they have
very,
on their faces?
Sorry?
Like tattoos?
In this case, they're actually reading about people who are violating norms. So Michelle is in the library and she's studying versus Michelle is in the library and she's shouting. We can measure how much activity is going on in the brain when people are processing that. And there's a very clear connection to how much people feel that their nation is threatened, to how quickly and how potently they actually process norm violations.
Did you look for a mix of ages, sexes,
Yeah.
social classes?
Yeah. And actually,
So
again,
within the same society, somebody, different age groups, millennials will have a very different take on something from people who are in their 60s and 70s.
Yeah, well, we asked people in this study about their country. So we asked them to tell us about the tightness and looseness of the United States. And people could share their perceptions about that context. But you can zoom in and see that in our data, for example, the working class, which is more threatened, is much tighter in their own local worlds.
So they want more rules?
That's right. When we give working class measures, we ask them about rules. And we ask them for 5 words that describe rules. We see very clearly that they have positive connotations with rules, whereas the middle class thinks that they're more negative. We even brought 3-year-olds into our lab from the working class and the middle class, and we wanted to see how do they react to norm violators. Now, you can't exactly ask 3-year-olds this question, but what you can do is have them interacting with a puppet. And the puppet is playing a game with the kids, and then all of a sudden, Max the puppet becomes a norm violator. And we can look to see exactly how are the kids reacting to Max when he's violating norms. And there's a big difference.
But don't people also pick and choose according to other inclinations? For example, the same people who judged Bill Clinton harshly for extramarital activities seem to be looking the other way when we hear about President Trump.
Yeah, well, there's a real, I think in many ways, there's a real fear around criticizing Trump. So we don't really know deep down how people are reacting. We know that publicly they're not calling him and having him be accountable. But back to the 3-year-olds, what we could see with those 3-year-olds is that they react very strongly from the working class to rule violations. So these differences arise very early in life. And I think that
because they're picking them up from their families.
That's right. Their parents are reporting that they know their kids have to avoid hard living. They have to avoid poverty. They're likely to be in dangerous jobs, and they need rules. And so it's really important to think about social class in terms of culture, not just bank accounts.
And it starts at around 3?
Well, at least at the age 3.
Because that's when we start telling kids are around 2 or 3, no, you can't do this, and yes, you can do that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Research in psychology shows that even infants start following social norms. So they prefer puppets who are actually, and they reach for puppets who are following rules versus puppets that violate the rules. Norms are so important for human beings that we take them for granted, and we don't realize how, as a species, we really need them.
But then there's always that rebellious kid within a very tight society.
Well, that's right.
How do we explain that? Is that a genetic thing?
I think that there's a lot of factors that could explain it. I have a quiz on my website to determine whether you have a tight or loose mindset. I think about it as sort of Muppets. Dahlia Lipton calls it the Muppet theory of the order Muppets or the chaos Muppets. And, some people have a tight mindset and they really attend to social rules and they're focused on minimizing mistakes and they're focused on managing their impulses and they like order. Other people are really kind of oblivious to social norms. They are really adventurous and not concerned about making mistakes. And they really are okay with ambiguity. We can measure this. And it's really interesting because I think in the household, the person you marry, your friends, we all can vary on this mindset. There could be a lot of conflict that comes from this. I'm lucky. My husband's definitely tighter than me, no question. But, it's something that you can also talk about. In my household, of course, the kids hear about this. My teenagers hear about tight, loose all the time. And we can sort of use this language to negotiate, what domains should be tight for these kids and what domains could be loose.
And the tighter person can handle certain situations better and the looser one other situations better.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, because they're able to fit into norms and situations that require self-regulation, people who are high in tightness. And even in organizations, we can see that organizations vary in terms of their tightness and looseness, in large part because of the industries that they're in. And people who choose occupations, often are choosing them based on their match with their mindset.
I want to come back to that in just a moment, but I want to remind the listeners that they're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large, and my guest is Michele Gelfand, whose book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World, is published by Scribner's. So let's follow up on what you were just talking about.
Well, I think that raising kids is itself a threatening context, especially, in the United States, where there's a lot of things that they could get in trouble with, right? I told my kids, let's move to Singapore if you don't behave yourself.
Because there you can be punished for chewing gum.
That's right. And actually, that's a really interesting point because it makes a lot of sense why you're not allowed to bring in large quantities of gum into Singapore. And
they don't want them on the sidewalk.
Well, think about, there's 20,000 people at least per square mile in Singapore. Let's compare that to like in New Zealand that has 50 people per square mile. They have more sheep per capita in New Zealand than people. And what happened was that people were taking their gum and just throwing it on the ground, and it was causing a massive national problem with the trains, with elevators. So Lee Kuan Yew, who was kind of a cultural psychologist, he designed Singapore with threat in mind. He said, guys, we need rules and we need to get rid of the gum. And that's what they did. He got rid of gum, and I think at first people were upset about it, but they understood. And if we lived in Singapore, we would also understand that mentality.
Yeah, but you don't see a lot of gum on the street here. People do chew gum. So couldn't they, instead of punishing people from chewing gum, just simply come up with some other set of rules to convince people that was antisocial?
I think that, in Singapore, because there's a lot of threat beyond just population density, there's been a history of invasions, food scarcity, there's a lot of diversity in a very strong area, that people are willing to give up freedom for security. I think Americans always sort of err on the line of, everything should be free. But in fact, in some cultures, having strong rules really helps.
Well, they also, wasn't an American college student caned for vandalism a few years ago?
And actually it created a lot of controversy. Bill Clinton had to get involved in this. This was the Michael Fay incident in the early 90s. And, it's interesting, Singapore is an example of a place that has very low crime. And so if you do things like litter and if you, in this case, vandalize property, you're going to get very strict punishments. And those punishments really deter people from doing things. And it was a massive cultural conflict.
And did you find that the residents of Singapore liked this?
I would say that people in tight cultures believe that rules are important.
They approved of them.
Yeah, I mean, China, it's another example. I think people think it's important to have monitoring on the internet. we look in these contexts and we think this is nasty. Why would people ever have monitoring? But it actually makes people behave better. And in our case, on the internet, it's one of these places where I say, and I talk about this in the book, that it needs to be tightened. It's a sort of cesspool of anti-normative behavior. It's people feel anonymous, and it's where we live these days. And we don't have many norms that are guiding our behavior in this very fundamental new place that we live.
They must have listened too much to Chris Christopherson's Me and Bobby McGee. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose.
Well, it's interesting. In the book, I talk a lot about what I call the Goldilocks principle of tight loose, that all cultures need some kind of balance of tightness and looseness.
Not too hot, not too cold.
Yeah, not too hot, not too soft, not too hard. I mean, Aristotle talked about this. Confucius talked about this. And then, this Goldilocks really had it right. Cultures or groups that get too tight or too loose have problems. They have higher suicide, less happiness. Even in households, having too tight of parenting or too hands-off of parenting produces problematic kids. So I think it's really a balance of freedom and constraint that we're seeking in every context that we interact in.
You include a chart of the countries you studied, rated from tightness to loosest. Which ones were the tightest? Which was the loosest? I guess the loosest of all was Ukraine.
Yeah. It's really interesting to look
at. Even
with
the invasion?
Well, this was done before that happened. But what's interesting to think about the Ukraine and other contexts in Eastern Europe is often it's the case that countries experience pendulum shifts. When they go from super tight and we release that tightness, they go to the opposite extreme of almost disorder. This happened in Egypt also. We can kind of predict when this is going to happen. When you have Mubarak being thrown out, there was very tight control. It went to the opposite extreme of, at first, people screaming, oh, we're free, but then realizing it's chaotic, it's disorderly. We need strong rulers, and that's why they went back to autocracy. I call it autocratic recidivism.
It seems to have applied to pretty much all the countries that went through Arab Spring. They all had a moment of, oh, we have democracy here, we're free, and almost every one of them has returned to some kind of authoritarian government.
That's right, with the exception of Tunisia. And what's interesting about Tunisia is that Tunisia had some kind of civic society that was brewing in it, just like Poland did. And, autocrats feed on, or they thrive on, getting people to distrust each other. So they're, in many autocratic countries, people are in their tiny little tribal groups. And so when you release that autocrat, it creates a lot of confusion and chaos, and people don't trust each other. And in Tunisia, I think there was more social trust, and that's why it's now rated as at least partly free, I believe, or even free. But Americans and our policymakers don't anticipate these pendulum shifts when you go from extremely tight to almost the opposite of total disorder. In sociology, Durkheim called this anomie. It's normlessness. We cannot exist in a normalist environment. So in these contexts, people crave order, and they crave strong autocratic leaders. You see this in the Philippines. I mean, Americans don't understand why do Filipinos, many of them love Duterte. And it's because Duterte came into a context where there was a lot of disorder, a lot of crime, a lot of social disorganization. And regardless of whether he's a norm violator himself, he restored order.
On the other hand, the rules that he seems to impose are rather loose. One day it's one rule, one day it's another.
Well,
doesn't that scare people? I could be shot for this, or it's perfectly acceptable?
Well, I think that like many emerging leaders, including our very own, who is the colossal norm violator, that a lot of times people overlook that kind of behavior, even if they find it really disdainful, because that person, in their view, is providing order and returning them to a traditional order. We see that with the population that is really supporting Trump.
But I still am confused about all of that, because traditionally the perception of the political parties was that the Republican Party would have been the party of tightness, and the Democrats would be the party of looseness. In fact, they used to accuse each other of just that. Yeah. And now suddenly we have a norm violator as the head of the Republican Party, and Republicans who are on record in the past for being very strongly pro-rules, including our vice president. They are strongly in support.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things operating here. Is that you can think about it as a hierarchy of needs. People who support Trump, including some of the working class who like rules, they're hoping to be returning to a traditional order that they're yearning for. So they're willing to overlook some of these really colossal norm violations when it comes to
etiquette. So they see
etiquette.
that as a personal thing as opposed to a societal
and
thing.
they see it as they're going to get back to their traditional order. They feel very much that the world is chaotic and threatened. And actually, the Democrats, I think, missed that in the last election. And the fact is that there's two things going on. The working class is really struggling, and we have to really deal with that. In other countries, there's more of a safety net for the working class. Here, we're loose. We tend to let people fend them for themselves. But also, what's happening in this country is that there's this exaggeration of threat. I wrote about it in Time magazine yesterday, including from our very own president. If you analyze his speeches, you hear threatening language all the time. And people catch on to that. The brain is very sensitive to that. So we have to really try to separate real threat from illusory threat.
We also interpret loose and tight in different ways. For example, the First Amendment, which has often been defended by people on the left, is now and it being defended by people on the right because they want to be able to say things that would have been considered unacceptable in another time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it is in the eye of the beholder to some extent. But again, I think it comes down to this kind of Goldilocks principle. We need to have some constraint. We have to balance that with freedom. It relates to, gun control is a really interesting issue in this regard. Like you're saying, it's really a paradox that here we have, people in the Republican Party endorsing, for the large part, looser norms around gun control. And our country has a massive problem, and it's explained by three things. One is the massive amount of guns we have. The second is that we evolved in the South in particular as an honor culture where people really needed to defend themselves. They came from context where there was weak institutions. But thirdly, we're loose. And that combination, that cocktail is a disaster. There's no other country, even Switzerland, where there's a lot of guns per capita. They have very tight norms. Or in the Middle East, there's an honor culture, but they don't have loose norms and they don't have a lot of guns. We have these three ingredients that are producing a really massive problem. And we need to tighten up. And we need to have more monitoring also in communities where in other contexts, when you notice, in other cultures, when you notice bad behavior, it's seen as a collective responsibility to also report this. And so I think, in my view, we have to have a better balance of tight-loose when it comes to gun control.
But Switzerland is not a really homogeneous society. It has a French-speaking group, it has German-speaking group, it has Italian-speaking group,
right.
But they all share certain things?
They do. They share a love of guns, but they share a collective responsibility for monitoring each other. And there's a tremendous amount of monitoring on the streets, both in Switzerland and Austria and Germany, that keeps people behaving themselves. And we might say that that's intrusive, but it actually creates an orderly society.
In talking about this, you brought up population density and historical or ecological threats a number of times. How do they play into this?
So you think about when you have a collective threat, like a natural disaster. Japan is one of the most threatened places, that we studied. They have many natural disasters. They have high population density. They have low arable land. They've had a lot of conflict. You need strong
earthquakes
rules.
And tsunamis.
Earthquakes. Yeah, I was there, terrified. Wanted to get out of there. They tend to need tight rules in order to coordinate, in order to survive. Even in our computational models, and when I work with some evolutionary game theorists at the University of Maryland, Dana Now, and others, we can actually set up models of artificial societies and activate threat and see how quickly they evolve to have strong rules and punishments. They're needed in those contexts. They can't survive those groups without them. So Japan's a great example of a place that has very strong rules. There's very low crime. Police have been known to try to get people to commit crime because it's so low. There's a funny Wait, Don't Tell Me show that was talking about what Japanese policemen need. They don't need better salaries or vacation time. They need more crime. And it's very orderly. It's very clean. It's very safe. I would love to raise teenagers there. But it's very high in discrimination, and it's lower on creativity. So these are the trade-offs.
But they also discriminate against foreigners, and they even discriminate against Koreans.
That's right.
Who go back a number of generations, back to the time when Japan had Korea as a colony.
Yeah, I mean, stigma in general is a massive problem in tight cultures, whether it's you're being unmarried, whether it's you're slightly overweight. I talk about
they have
in the
an
book.
Aboriginal group that they also discriminate against, even though they were in Japan before the current Japanese came there.
Yeah, I mean, this is the trade-off. Tight cultures have order, but they have low openness. There's some discussions of on trains in Japan that the conductors sometimes say things like, "We apologize, there's too many foreigners on board."
They really apologize?
But again, we trade that for
the MTA
low
doesn't
crime.
even apologize for being late.
I know. Well, that's right. Actually, even our most heavily traveled lines on Amtrak and others are right in the book. York, they're like incredibly late. That's a coordination issue. Actually, you mentioned the clocks. I mean, we have actually looked at around the world how accurate are clocks in city streets. And it's phenomenally interesting to see that they're actually like within seconds of accuracy in tight cultures. But in Brazil or in Greece, for example, they're like sometimes like many minutes apart.
Michele Gelfand is a distinguished university professor of psychology at University of Maryland, College Park. And her book, the one we are discussing, is Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. It's published by Script. We go back now to Michele Gelfand, who's my guest on Leonard Lopate at Large today. Her book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. You mentioned Japan as a country that has a rather tight culture. What about some other Asian countries like Korea, India, China? They also have high population density. Do they also have tight cultures?
Yeah, they do. I mean, when we measure, for example, how many times has your country been invaded over the last 100 years, or what's your population density, or how many natural disasters have there been? Those are very key predictors of tightness. And actually, when my youngest daughter, Hannah, was young, she asked me, Mom, are we worried about Canada and Mexico invading us? And these are the things that kids say that's really remarkable. And you're like, wow, we take that for granted. As a nation, we're separated by 2 oceans. We've had our share of conflict, but not on our own soil. And as soon as we have some conflict on our own soil, after 9/11, we tightened up. And so we can experience, or after the Boston bombing, I measured the desire for tightness. It increased dramatically in these contexts.
If your kids were Canadian, they would have the opposite question, because we call it the War of 1812. You know what the Canadians call it? The War of the American Invasion.
Yeah.
Because
actually,
we started that war invading what was then a British colony, Canada.
That's right. And actually, in the South, when people talk about the Civil War, Colin Woodward, a historian, talks about people in the South thought that they were being invaded by the North. The South, in our data, is of the tightest regions.
They don't remember
the
that they shot at Fort Sumter?
Yeah, apparently not. I think even after the war, American troops were in the South, occupying the South. And the South is also experiences the most natural disasters in the country, and there's a strong connection with that and tightness.
So it's tighter in the South?
Definitely, yeah. And
does it matter whether you're white or black?
Well, that's an interesting question, because basically what we could see is that people in high power positions they live in looser worlds across the board. People in lower status positions, like women, minorities, people who are stigmatized for other reasons, even athletes, like we saw this weekend, Serena Williams, argued that she's living in a tighter world, that she's getting stronger punishments for the same exact infractions. And we've actually measured that. We see that people do punish women and minorities more for the same behavior. And actually, the pattern is that white men in our data tend to let other white men off the hook. So there is a sense that we live in different worlds. We're held to different standards because power allows for latitude.
You mentioned earlier that there are some countries with low population density, New Zealand, Australia. Are they looser?
Yeah, they are. I mean, actually, a couple of years ago, I got interviewed by someone in New Zealand to ask me, why do people in New Zealand walk barefoot in banks? Why are they walking? I mean, I'm sure it's not everywhere, but New Zealand tends to have a pretty permissive culture. There's many protests. New Zealand's one of the only countries I know that has its own national wizard. This guy was hanging out. He was a former UK professor, and he went into New Zealand, and he just started hanging out and publicly protesting. And instead of getting heckled or getting arrested, the prime minister at the time declared him to be the national wizard, and he was really charged with entertaining the country.
But you also found that most of the countries in Latin America would be considered looser.
Yeah.
There's population density in some of those countries.
Does
it matter whether we're talking Argentina, big cities like the capitals of Brazil or Argentina or
well, what's interesting,
Venezuela right now, a really troubled country?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that we have this dimension in our field that's called collectivism, individualism. How family-oriented are you? And tightness is different because Latin America is very family-oriented, but they have very loose norms. They're much more permissive. They have a lot of diversity. Brazil is a very diverse country. And when you have a lot of diversity, for example, it pushes you toward looseness. And the same with Israel. Israel's kind of a really interesting anomaly. In all fronts, it should
you would have thought that it
should be tight.
Country.
But there's a couple of reasons why Israel, in general, is loose, although obviously there's pockets of tight and loose. In Israel, it's getting more polarized like the United United States in terms of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv seeming like very different universes. But interestingly, Israel is also very diverse, and also the religious context. This is why it's important to take any historical context into account. Judaism is a religion of debate. There's the adage, 3 Jews in the room and there's 10 opinions. And so a lot of debate pushes groups toward looseness. And so that's why we can see how Israel, even though we would expect it to be tight, there's really good reasons why it's not.
What about Sharia law? Does that encourage a tight culture?
Yeah.
Or what about Buddhism?
Well, I consider myself a Jewish Buddhist. So, and of course, people will say, well, aren't there Buddhist terrorists around the world? But, actually Buddhism is a very incredible philosophy because it is about having gratitude and having understanding and tolerance. But Sharia law, of course, this is a system where there's a lot of strict rules and a lot of severe punishments.
And then there are some countries that are more Christian than others.
Yeah, that's right. In general, when you have more religiosity and you feel like God is watching you and you're threatened by, things like the afterlife, then it produces more tightness.
Is that what leads to variations in Europe? We tend to think of the Germanic countries, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, as being tighter, although, and the Latin countries, Spain, Italy, as having looser cultures.
Yeah.
Was that the case?
We didn't actually find that pattern particularly, but it's really interesting to see that that the same pattern we see with Spain has a lot of commonality with Latin America and having looser norms. But what we also see, and we kind of predicted this with the data, is that Venezuela at the time was veering extremely loose, like the Ukraine. And when you have that extreme looseness, it begets tightness, and because it's hard to be in a context that there's such extreme disorder. And I think that pendulum shift is something we need to pay more attention to in politics.
What about the Scandinavian countries? Are countries that are ethnically homogeneous tighter than the heterogeneous ones?
Well, we actually didn't have the possibility of studying a lot of Scandinavian countries, but we did study Norway, and Norway in our data came up as quite tight. It is very homogeneous,
but they have a heavy influx of immigrants recently. In fact, all the Scandinavian countries have.
Yeah, I think that is also seen as a threat in many countries that have not had that experience diversity. You look at the Netherlands, which is one of the only countries that did not resort to populism in terms of their election. They've had a long history of experience with other cultures. It was very helpful for them economically, and the Netherlands is a very loose culture.
So this move toward populism, in some cases neo-fascism, and almost glorification of Nazi traditions, is that an indication that these countries are moving towards tighter societies, but by choice?
Well, I think it's both by choice because we live in a world of great disruption and people feel that sense of insecurity and that disorder. And so they're looking for, Erich Fromm talked about this years ago, the psychologist, philosophers, that when people see disorder, like in Germany, when they feel like they're suffering, they yearn for strong men, like autocratic leaders, to help them return to that kind of sense of order. And then sometimes politicians also use this to their advantage. They're almost like cultural psychologists. They activate threat, they target people who are feeling threatened, and then they ride that wave to the White House or to whatever, presidential palace. And you see that, Viktor Orbán, he's using threatening language to tighten the country. You see that even in Le Pen and other contexts all around Europe. We see this, that leaders are playing into this primal fear of becoming too loose. And actually, when we measured people's support of Trump or Le Pen, we could see very clearly that people that really wanted those people elected felt very threatened, and they thought that their contexts were too loose.
I've been curious about the whole response to immigrants, because I can understand on some level why people in European countries might feel threatened when there's a huge influx of immigrants. But the United States is a country that's made up of immigrants. Yeah. Have we just a short-term memory about that? It's
really astonishing to see. I think it's also partly racism, the types of immigrants that are coming to this country versus nowadays versus in the early part of this.
We excluded Asians.
That's
for
right,
a very long time,
and Jews as well. I think what's happening is, and people call this echo chambers. We're becoming so fearful of the other that we don't have dialogue, and it's easy to just sort of jump on these very isolated incidents, like it happened in Iowa, where this woman, Molly, a college student, was murdered by an undocumented immigrant. We don't we know that they're not actually engaging in these kinds of crimes, but we overemphasize them based on that it's just so salient to us. And I'm really proud of Americans, and especially her father, who went on national public radio and said, we have to stop stereotyping undocumented immigrants. They're not representative, this guy, of other immigrants, just like a neo-Nazi is not representative of white people. And we have to have more of those dialogues. And you see it happening. We need to promote it more.
Stephen Miller's uncle wrote an article on Political criticizing him because he said our family would all have been wiped out if America had allowed us to come here during the Nazi era.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable because in our research, we can see that immigrants, and we've studied Muslim immigrants, they clearly, the vast majority want to integrate into American culture. They want to be American, and they also want to hold on to their traditions, just like all of us have as immigrants. And we misunderstand people. We are stereotyping people as being un-American, when that's just not the fact.
Are countries with a rigid class system tighter than those without? I'm wondering about comparing, let's say, the caste system of India with the British class system, which the Beatles were supposed to have obliterated, but hasn't been obliterated.
That's right. Even language can signify like what class you're coming from in the UK, and clearly the caste system in England, your accent. And I think that that's right. I mean, those are very rigid hierarchies that have very strong rules, and you can't easily have mobility across those divides. And mobility is really a great predictor of looseness. If you can come and go into different contexts in your country or different classes and have that ability and that freedom to move, then it produces looseness. In China, for a long time, you couldn't even move without a certificate that allowed you to move. So this is an important issue when it comes to caste as well.
How does a country's tightness rating affect its citizens' quality of life? Are there upsides and downsides to both?
Well, I mean, you can think about two things. One is the order versus openness trade-off. Tight cultures tend to have more rules and they have more order because they need it. They're very threatened. So, but they're less open, and vice versa. With loose cultures, they tend to have less order. They're more disorganized. Their trains don't run on time, but they're more open. So it depends on your vantage point. I will say, though, that in the extremes tend to have dysfunctionality. So that's an important issue, is that when we get to either too tight or too loose, then we see that society start to break down.
I'm speaking with Michele Gelfand. Her book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. It's published by Scribner. How does this apply to parenting? Because the parents live in these tight or loose cultures. Do they pass on those attitudes to their children?
Yeah, that's a great question. If all families veer tight or loose based on their circumstance, the working class, for example, trying to avoid the dregs of poverty, have stronger rules. They need them. But I think that all family systems need to think about the level of norm strength that they want to have, because becoming either too tight or too loose is problematic. And once you have the language of tight and loose, you can start talking about it with your spouse. You can talk about it with your kids. You can think about, what domains do I really need to be tight in? In my household, I decided that the domain of let's say, sloppiness is going to be loose. I'm going to let the kids be kind of slops, because I have many domains that I want them to be tight in which case there's stronger rules, and I can't legislate every possible domain. My husband doesn't agree with me on this, so it's also a matter of, you have to negotiate this with your spouse. But doing well in school is a tight domain. Treating your sister with politeness and respect is a tight domain. I was told by my kids that they thought that would beat them if they weren't nice to each other. I mean, I obviously wouldn't, but that's my point, is that you can think about social media as one domain, appearance, language, school performance,
how the kids dress.
How they dress. These are all things we have to think about. How tight or loose can we tolerate each of these domains? And none of us are given a handbook on how to parent. I remember leaving the hospital and thinking, you're really going to let me bring this kid home with me? Like, we have no idea, and tight loose is a really important dimension in households to really keep in mind as you're parenting and as you're even managing finances. People have very different rules around finances, and it causes a lot of conflict, and it relates to the strength of norms. And
you mentioned earlier that your own marriage is a merger of tighter and looser. Can your theory be used to improve interpersonal relations?
I think it can, because often we have to step back and say, why is that person tight or loose? What's the rationale for why they are? And then you can kind of negotiate it. I study and I teach negotiation, and we have to get to our underlying interests and say, okay, let's trade off on our high and low priorities. Not everything has to be tight, not everything has to be loose. Which domains are really important to us, and then we can have more happiness and bliss in those marriages.
Well, that old idea that opposites attract doesn't really seem to apply in most cases. I'm wondering about whether whether it's when someone from a tight culture marries a person from a looser culture, whether that is what their chances for success are.
We haven't studied that, but it's a fascinating question. I can tell you that when organizations merge that have big differences in tight and loose, they suffer in terms of financial performance.
Corporate mergers.
Corporate mergers. We just studied about 6,000 corporate mergers around the world, and these are big deals, over $10 million. And we control for many different things. That means we take into account, their wealth. We take into account the size of the deal, and we can see that when there's a mismatch in tight and loose, a big mismatch, it costs a lot of money and it costs a lot of reputational problems in our data. Stock prices go down for the companies. And so it's really important that people do this kind of due diligence before they merge or before they marry, whether they're an organizational marriage or an interpersonal marriage.
And they don't do that? Because I can imagine the kinds of disasters you would have when you have people from who are doing the same kind of job from different companies, where one was kind of, I'll show up when I show up, and hey, I'm ready to go to lunch now, and the other ones which live in a much more rigid situation.
I mean, you would think that they do, because the people, the practices, the leaders that you find in tight and loose organizations, they vary tremendously. I talk about this in the book. But what happens is that people are attracted to someone because they seem financially lucrative, or they seem to fit their strategy, but they don't think about the cultural misfit, the cultural iceberg they're about to hit. Daimler Chrysler is a great example of a massive problem with tight loose. I mean, this was a marriage that was made in heaven. So was Amazon and Whole Foods, for that matter. I mean, I think it's getting better.
Is there a problem at Amazon and Whole Foods?
There was, yeah. I mean, Amazon was a tight ship, and Whole Foods was a looser ship. They're founded by very different personalities. They're in very different industries, and the match looked really good, but then they really struggled. And I talk about to chief learning officers and other people in organizations that you need to do this kind of assessment ahead of time. Tight cultures need to think about what domains can I loosen up a little bit in, where I can have more discretion. And loose cultures have to sort of say, how can I give up some of my autonomy? Where can I be more structured? Because often it's the case. For example, one manufacturing firm I interviewed, they wanted to loosen up, so they hired an R&D company to come in, and then they just couldn't stand each other. The R&D thought, these people are crazy, they're so tight. And the tight group was like, these people are so unstructured, they can't get anything done. But they never negotiated this. They never anticipated that underlying this was a threat, that the tight groups don't want to lose control, the loose groups don't want to lose autonomy, but we have to anticipate these conflicts, and we can and do better.
But the suggestion here is that both work if you want them to work. If you have a corporation that has kind of loose rules, but it's a success, then that's a good system. And if it has tight rules and it's a success, so it probably is more like a top-down decision, isn't it?
Well, it's also, the people who are attracted to these organizations come in with certain tight or loose mindsets. But all organizations
need
MBA
this. Programs? You work in an MBA program.
I work in a psych department.
Yeah, but you teach psychology to MBA students.
I teach
and what is their reaction to all of this?
Well, I think that, it's interesting that we train our managers to understand finance and accounting, and we send them abroad based on their technical expertise. We don't send them abroad based on their cultural intelligence. And I talk about in the book that CQ, as it's called, is far more important when you're going abroad and when you're negotiating with people from other cultures than IQ is. And what's remarkable is that because culture is so invisible, we don't take it into account, even when we're sending people abroad.
So when we send people abroad, we have to warn them, you're going to a looser culture, or you're going to a tighter culture. Well, you're going to Greece, where it's okay to run up a big debt.
Oh, yeah, that Germany-Greece debacle was a large part, a lot of tight-loose elements to it, with Merkel, sort of the overlooking and babysitting Greece. I mean, what's remarkable is that we don't tend to train our managers or our military when they're going abroad in culture. I get some big grants from the Department of Defense who really now realize we really need to not put our personnel at risk in other regions. We need to understand not just what culture they're going to be engaging in, but also why the culture's evolved to be the way it is. When you understand, for example, honor cultures, I study honor cultures in the Middle East, and they have a really important rationale. And there's so many ways that you can cause people to lose honor. And I've documented that in my research. And these are important things because Americans are not trying to violate other people's honor, but they don't realize the kinds of things that could really do that. Even talking on my phone or looking at my phone in a business meeting could be seen as dishonorable because it's saying to someone, I don't respect you enough to put my phone away. So there's very small ways of violating honor that are really super important.
And we've seen that with American bases in Okinawa, for example, where there's constant tension, even if the base has been there for 40, 50 years.
Yeah, that's right, because we tend to send in our little enclaves, we don't understand the cultures that we're operating in. If we had a little bit more understanding, we'd have more empathy. And it's interesting, one of my favorite books is called All About Wa, and it's all about Japanese baseball and how American baseball players going over to Japan, they just couldn't handle it. It looked like the same exact game. I mean, the number of innings, everything. But the cultural values and norms were so fundamentally different that it caused a lot of players to come back early.
On the other hand, there have been a number of great successes of Japanese players coming here. That tightness doesn't seem to be a problem when they come to the looser culture.
I think that's extremely interesting. We found recently that people have a much harder time going to tight cultures, particularly who don't have the personalities that are kind of tight mindset. But we found that people coming from tight cultures to loose cultures actually adapt easier. And that's because they're trained to be attentive to the norms. And they're trained to understand that there's a big differences in what's required. And I think that might be what's operating there.
We don't have much time, but how do you think this all plays a role in the recent tensions with the EEU, with Mexico, with Canada? Mexico, I would assume, is seen as a looser culture. Is Canada?
Canada is relatively loose. I mean, we haven't studied Canada with our actual measures, but I would argue that they're loose.
Well, there's not a lot of population density.
That's right. And they also have a lot of diversity. There's the United States is a melting pot metaphor where we all want to kind of meld together. Canada has more of a salad bowl metaphor. They want to respect that diversity. They also have problems, of course, with diversity, but they definitely err on the loose side.
On the other hand, we talked about New Zealand and Australia, which without population density being loose, but then you look at North and South Dakota, Montana. They have, I think, North Dakota has, somebody pointed out, has fewer residents than people who go through Grand Central Station on any given day. And yet, it's a very conservative state.
Actually, in our data, South Dakota and North Dakota are right in the middle. Actually,
solidly red states.
They're solidly red state, but in terms of their social norms, they are more in the sort of mid-range of tolerance. Actually, I think South Dakota had one of the first. I was on South Dakota radio yesterday, so I was looking into South Dakota, and I think they had like this place where people could come and get divorced. One of the first places in the United States where you can actually go there. To your point about alcohol, you can go there and get divorced. Early on in its history.
And Nevada was a place which actually touted the fact that it was loose?
Yeah, Nevada is pretty loose in our data. Yeah. And so, we can kind of think about the red state, blue state is really not that useful. I mean, what I think is more important is the deeper cultural codes that are defining your everyday interaction.
So how do we apply all of this to politics, to our everyday lives? Is this just a matter of, wow, isn't that interesting?
I think you got to read the book. Because I think it's just this powerful, important cultural code that's driving our behavior. It's driving our behavior in our households. It's driving our politics. It's driving change around the world. When we look at Brexit, we can see that it's following the same dynamic of people who feel threatened and they want a tight order. They want to kind of get back to a tight order. And we have to anticipate these issues. So it applies to politics. It applies to organizations. Norms are everywhere. And so once you start seeing the world through a tight and loose lens, even this interview is kind of tight. If I started singing and dancing and breaking out some bourbon during this interview, your listeners would say, why did you have this crazy Gelfand on your show?
Well, it all depends on whether you offered me a drink or not.
So I think, once you start realizing it, we effortlessly are able to adapt to strong and tight or loose situations. We're in a library, we're able to kind of have more self-control. We're able to manage our impulses. We become tighter in a library than in a park.
I've been amused by these commercials. A number of different companies have been doing commercials about people speaking out loud in a library and being shushed.
Well, actually, we even measured how loud our country is with some decibel readers around the world. And clearly, tight cultures are quieter.
Michele Gelfand is a distinguished university professor of psychology at University of Maryland. Her book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World, is published by Scribner's. And that brings us to the end of this show. My great thanks to today's guest, Michele Gelfand, to Barbara Kahn, who produced this segment, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, and to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.